The Gilded Age is often remembered as a slow fade, a graceful sunset on an era of marble mansions, silk gowns, and limitless ambition. But that memory is wrong. The Gilded Age did not quietly dissolve into history. It did not gently evolve into something more restrained or responsible. It did not end through reform alone. It broke, and it broke suddenly. For decades, America lived inside an illusion of permanence. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel, oil, and finance generated fortunes so large they seemed immune to time. Cities rose vertically, powered by industrial confidence and cheap labor. Newspapers celebrated tycoons as heroes. Society pages treated excess as proof of progress. To many observers, it appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the system was already fractured. Wealth was concentrated in unprecedented ways. Political power had fused with private capital. Labor unrest simmered in factories, mines, and rail yards. Farmers collapsed under debt. Banks operated on speculation rather than stability. The same mechanisms that produced astonishing growth also created extreme fragility. The collapse did not announce itself politely. It arrived as a chain reaction. When financial confidence cracked, it did not weaken gradually. It vanished. The Panic of 1893 exposed how little structural support existed beneath the glitter. Railroads failed almost overnight. Banks closed their doors without warning. Entire industries froze. Millions lost their jobs in a matter of months. Breadlines replaced ballroom invitations. Mansions stood lit but empty. This was not the end of wealth. It was the end of belief. The belief that fortunes could endlessly regenerate themselves. The belief that private power could replace public responsibility. The belief that social order could be maintained without balance. What followed was not recovery, but reckoning. Families who had built empires discovered that scale did not equal durability. Estates became liabilities. Heirs inherited symbols without systems. Many of the great houses that defined the era survived only because they were repurposed, donated, or dismantled entirely. Others disappeared so completely that only photographs remain. The break was psychological as much as financial. The public no longer trusted the mythology. Industrialists who had once been praised became targets of anger. The press shifted tone. Reform movements gained traction not because they were persuasive, but because the old structure had proven incapable of protecting itself. And yet, the most important truth is this: the forces that shattered the Gilded Age were not external. They were internal. The era collapsed under the weight of its own design. The same systems that rewarded concentration, speed, and speculation left no room for resilience. This documentary examines that moment of rupture, not as nostalgia, not as moral judgment, but as a structural autopsy. We will trace how wealth was built, how it was displayed, and why it failed all at once instead of fading away. We will look at the mansions, the markets, the families, and the warning signs that were ignored until they became unavoidable. If you want to understand how eras truly end, not with ceremony, but with sudden silence, this story matters. If you want to understand why modern wealth still echoes the same risks, this story matters even more. Subscribe now and continue with us as we uncover how the Gilded Age didn't end. It broke. The Gilded Age was never a stable system. It only appeared stable because its failures were delayed. For nearly half a century after the Civil War, the United States experienced economic expansion at a speed no previous society had sustained. Railroads multiplied, steel production surged, oil, finance, and manufacturing reorganized the entire economy. Fortunes were created not over generations, but within single lifetimes. This velocity produced wealth, but it also concealed weakness. Industrial growth was uneven from the beginning. While cities expanded upward and outward, much of the country remained economically fragile. Farmers relied on volatile commodity prices and borrowed heavily to modernize their equipment. Urban workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and wages that barely kept pace with inflation. Immigrants poured into cities faster than infrastructure could support them. Yet, at the top, profits grew exponentially. This imbalance was not accidental. It was structural. By the late 19th century, the American economy had become deeply dependent on speculation. Railroads, the backbone of national expansion, were financed through complex layers of debt. Lines were built ahead of demand, not in response to it. Investors assumed continued growth was inevitable. Banks extended credit aggressively. Trusts consolidated industries, eliminating competition, but also concentrating risk. When confidence held, the system functioned. When it faltered, there were no buffers. That faltering arrived suddenly in 1893. The collapse began quietly, as many financial disasters do. A major railroad declared bankruptcy. Then, another. Within months, dozens followed. Railroad failures were not isolated events. They rippled outward through banks, suppliers, and regional economies. Railroads were among the largest employers in the nation. When they failed, entire communities lost income at once. Banks holding railroad bonds saw their assets evaporate. Credit froze. The event that would later be called the Panic of 1893 was not a single crash, but a cascade. Confidence evaporated faster than institutions could respond. More than 500 banks closed. Thousands of businesses failed. By some estimates, unemployment reached nearly 20% nationwide. In industrial cities, it was higher. The speed of the collapse shocked contemporaries. Many had assumed that American growth, unlike earlier European booms, was immune to sudden reversals. The country had land, resources, labor, and innovation. What it lacked was coordination. There was no central banking system capable of stabilizing credit. Federal intervention was minimal by design. Relief was considered a private matter. For working Americans, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Wages disappeared overnight. Savings vanished with failed banks. Breadlines formed in cities that had recently hosted extravagant galas. Tent cities appeared on the outskirts of urban centers. One such encampment, established by unemployed workers in Washington, D.C., became known as Coxey's Army, a public symbol of desperation marching directly toward the federal government. For the wealthy, the crisis revealed a different kind of vulnerability. Large fortunes remained on paper, but liquidity disappeared. Estates were asset-rich and cash-poor. Maintaining multiple homes, staffs, and social obligations required steady income. When dividends stopped and rents went unpaid, expenses continued. The illusion that wealth automatically sustained itself collapsed alongside the markets. This moment exposed a fundamental flaw of the Gilded Age elite. Their wealth was expansive but inflexible. It had been built for display, not endurance. Mansions consumed resources without producing revenue. Social hierarchies demanded constant spending. There were no institutional mechanisms to preserve capital across downturns. Inheritance laws divided estates. Trusts were underdeveloped. Many heirs inherited responsibility without preparation. The public response hardened quickly. Sympathy for industrial leaders evaporated. Newspapers that had once celebrated tycoons shifted tone. Labor unrest intensified. Strikes erupted across industries, driven by wage cuts and layoffs. The most infamous of these was the Pullman strike, which paralyzed rail traffic across much of the nation. When federal troops were deployed to break the strike, violence followed. The image of soldiers confronting workers, crystallized a growing belief that the state existed to protect capital, not citizens. Trust in institutions eroded. The idea that private enterprise alone could manage national prosperity lost credibility. Reform movements gained momentum not because they were radical, but because the alternative had failed so completely. Calls for banking reform, labor protections, and antitrust legislation became unavoidable. The old system had not merely produced inequality, it had proven incapable of stabilizing itself. What makes this period distinctive is not that wealth disappeared. It did not. Many fortunes survived in reduced form. Some even expanded after consolidation. What ended was the cultural confidence that had defined the era, the belief that progress was automatic, the belief that scale equaled strength, the belief that private wealth could substitute for public systems. This psychological break is often overlooked. Histories frequently describe the Gilded Age as transitioning into the progressive era, as though one philosophy simply replaced another. In reality, the shift was forced by collapse. Reform followed failure, not foresight. The architecture of excess remained standing, but its meaning changed. Mansions once viewed as triumphs began to feel anachronistic, even obscene. Families adjusted in different ways. Some quietly liquidated assets, others donated properties to institutions, converting private extravagance into public legacy. Many houses were abandoned, subdivided, or demolished. Entire neighborhoods of elite residences vanished within a generation. The landscape of American wealth visibly contracted. At the national level, the crisis accelerated political change. Populist movements gained influence by articulating what many already felt, that the system was rigged toward those who controlled capital. Gold versus silver debates dominated politics. Monetary policy, once considered technical and dull, became a mass concern. Economic questions moved from boardrooms into public discourse. Yet even as reform advanced, the deeper lesson remained unresolved. The structures that produced the collapse were not dismantled entirely. They were modified. Capital continued to concentrate, though more cautiously. Regulation expanded, but unevenly. The cycle of boom and bust slowed, but it did not disappear. The Gilded Age did not end because its ideas were disproven. It ended because its excesses exceeded the system's capacity to absorb them. What happened in the 1890s set a pattern that would repeat. Rapid expansion followed by speculative overreach. Concentration of wealth followed by social instability. Crisis followed by reform. The names change. The technologies change. The underlying dynamics persist. Understanding this moment matters because it reframes how eras end. The Gilded Age did not decline gracefully. It did not fade through cultural evolution. It reached a breaking point. And when it broke, it exposed how fragile systems, built on speed, concentration, and confidence, truly are. This was the moment when America learned that prosperity without structure is temporary. That growth without balance creates instability. And that wealth, no matter how vast, cannot insulate itself from the consequences of the system that created it. The break was sudden. The shock was permanent. And the aftershocks would shape the 20th century long after the panic itself faded from memory. What followed the initial collapse was not a clean reset, but a prolonged period of adjustment that revealed just how unprepared the Gilded Age structure had been for survival under pressure. The economy did not rebound quickly. The depression that followed the panic of 1893 dragged on for years, making it one of the longest economic downturns in American history up to that point. Recovery was uneven, slow, and socially destabilizing. For the upper class, the crisis forced a reckoning with the realities of liquidity and maintenance. The great estates of the era had been designed as statements, not systems. They consumed capital continuously. Staff wages, repairs, imported materials, and social obligations did not pause simply because markets collapsed. Property taxes still came due. Heating vast interiors through winter required fuel whether rooms were occupied or not. Many families discovered that wealth tied up in land, art, and architecture could not be converted quickly enough to meet daily costs. This exposed a deeper contradiction at the heart of Gilded Age wealth. The culture prized visibility over sustainability. Fortunes were measured by scale, not flexibility. A mansion demonstrated success, but it produced nothing. It did not adapt to downturns. It could not shrink when income declined. Instead, it became a fixed burden, turning prestige into liability almost overnight. At the same time, inheritance practices magnified the damage. Large estates were frequently divided among heirs rather than preserved as unified entities. Unlike European aristocratic systems, American wealth lacked long-established mechanisms to protect capital across generations. Trusts existed, but they were often poorly structured or underutilized. As a result, family fortunes fragmented just as the economy demanded consolidation and resilience. The impact extended beyond individual families to entire social ecosystems. Domestic service, which had supported hundreds of thousands of workers, began to contract. Large households reduced staff or closed entirely. Skilled servants found themselves competing for fewer positions at lower wages. Employment that had once been stable vanished quietly. This shift altered class relationships inside the home, long before it became visible in public policy. Meanwhile, industrial labor faced harsher consequences. Factory closures and wage cuts created conditions ripe for unrest. The idea that hard work guaranteed security had already been strained. Now it collapsed. Workers who had endured long hours during boom years found themselves discarded when profits shrank. This sense of betrayal fueled radicalization. Labor movements grew more organized, more confrontational, and more politically aware. The response from government institutions revealed the limitations of 19th-century political philosophy. Federal leaders largely viewed economic downturns as self-correcting. Intervention was minimal. Relief was framed as charity rather than obligation. This absence of structural support deepened public resentment. When troops were deployed against striking workers, the message was unmistakable. Stability would be enforced, not negotiated. This moment fundamentally altered public perception of wealth and power. The mythology of the self-made industrialist lost credibility. Figures once celebrated as builders of the nation began to appear as beneficiaries of imbalance. Investigative journalism, later known as muckraking, gained influence by documenting corruption, exploitation, and political collusion. The cultural tide turned sharply. At the same time, philanthropy began to shift in tone and purpose. Donations were no longer simply acts of generosity or prestige. They became tools of legacy management. Wealthy families sought to convert excess into moral capital. Libraries, universities, museums, and hospitals proliferated. These institutions served public needs, but they also reframed private wealth as socially constructive. This was not accidental. It was adaptive behavior in response to scrutiny. Architecture mirrored this transition. The construction of massive private residences slowed dramatically. New wealth, when it appeared, was more cautious. Urban apartments replaced standalone palaces. Houses became smaller, more functional, less symbolic. The idea that wealth should be invisible rather than ostentatious began to take hold. This was not humility. It was risk management. By the early 20th century, reform movements gained legislative traction. Antitrust laws challenged monopolies. Banking reforms sought stability. Labor protections expanded gradually. These changes are often described as progressive evolution, but they were reactive. They emerged from failure, not foresight. The Gilded Age elite had not planned for reform. It had forced it. Yet the most profound consequence of the collapse was psychological. The era's defining confidence never returned in the same form. Wealth continued to exist, but it no longer carried the assumption of permanence. The idea that markets could correct themselves without oversight was permanently weakened. The belief that private power alone could organize society lost authority. Importantly, this did not produce equality. The collapse did not democratize wealth, it reorganized it. Some families survived by adapting early, others disappeared quietly. New fortunes emerged in technology, finance, and media, shaped by the lessons of instability. The cycle continued, but with greater awareness of its risks. The Gilded Age's sudden break also reshaped how Americans understood time and progress. The 19th century had embraced linear optimism. Tomorrow would be larger, faster, richer than today. After the collapse, progress became conditional. Growth required safeguards. Expansion demanded oversight. This shift laid the groundwork for 20th century economic policy, even when those lessons were later forgotten. In hindsight, the collapse appears inevitable. The concentration of wealth, the absence of regulation, the reliance on speculation, and the cultural obsession with display created a system that could not absorb shock. What makes the period remarkable is not that it failed, but how completely its participants believed it would not. The Gilded Age did not end with a ceremony or a declaration. It ended when confidence broke faster than institutions could respond, when structures designed for growth proved incapable of survival, when the illusion of permanence dissolved in a matter of months. What remained afterward was a nation forced to confront the difference between wealth and stability, between prosperity and resilience, between appearing powerful and being durable. That distinction, learned through collapse rather than choice, would echo through every major economic crisis that followed. As the 20th century approached, the aftermath of the Gilded Age collapse reshaped American behavior in ways that were subtle, structural, and long-lasting. The most visible symbols of the era, its mansions, its dynastic families, its rituals of excess, did not disappear immediately. What changed was how they functioned within the economy and the public imagination. They were no longer engines of confidence, they became reminders of risk. One of the clearest shifts occurred in how wealth was managed. Before the collapse, expansion had been the default strategy. Capital was expected to grow simply by being deployed aggressively. After the collapse, preservation replaced expansion as the primary objective. Wealth holders became preoccupied with insulation rather than visibility. Lawyers, accountants, and financial planners gained influence. Capital structures became more complex, more guarded, and less theatrical. This transition marked the quiet end of the Gilded Age mindset. The era had rewarded boldness, speed, and scale. Its collapse rewarded caution, discretion, and diversification. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not often faded within a generation. The physical landscape reflected this transformation. Many of the grand urban mansions were repurposed as private clubs, institutions, or multi-unit residences. Others were demolished outright. Their disappearance was not simply a matter of changing taste, it was economic reality. The cost of maintaining such structures no longer made sense in a society increasingly focused on efficiency and mobility. The very features that had once symbolized power, size, ornamentation, isolation, became disadvantages. Social behavior shifted as well. The rigid hierarchies that had defined elite life softened, not out of empathy, but necessity. Maintaining rigid separation required resources that were no longer guaranteed. The elite retreated from public display. Charity replaced spectacle. Discretion replaced dominance. This change often gets misinterpreted as moral progress. In truth, it was adaptive retreat. At the national level, the collapse left a permanent imprint on political thought. The idea that the federal government should remain passive during economic crises lost legitimacy. Though reforms came slowly, the intellectual groundwork had been laid. The crisis demonstrated that private capital could destabilize the nation when left unchecked. This understanding would resurface during later crises, shaping responses decades later. The progressive era reforms that followed were not radical departures from capitalism. They were attempts to stabilize it. Antitrust laws sought to prevent destructive consolidation. Banking reforms aimed to prevent sudden credit freezes. Labor protections attempted to reduce volatility by stabilizing wages and working conditions. Each reform addressed a vulnerability exposed by the collapse. Yet the tension between wealth and stability remained unresolved. Reform limited excess, but it did not eliminate inequality. Instead, it redefined how inequality was managed. Wealth became quieter. Power became more institutional. The era of flamboyant individual dominance gave way to corporate and bureaucratic authority. This shift is critical to understanding why the Gilded Age feels distant, yet familiar. Its visible symbols disappeared, but its underlying dynamics persisted. Concentration of wealth did not end. It became more abstract, less architectural, more financial. Risk migrated from railroads and steel mills to markets and instruments. The surface changed. The structure endured. The cultural memory of the collapse faded faster than its lessons. By the 1920s, confidence returned. New fortunes emerged. Speculation resumed under different names. The belief in perpetual growth reasserted itself. This amnesia would prove costly. When the system failed again during the Great Depression, many of the same patterns reappeared, only on a larger scale. What distinguishes the Gilded Age collapse is that it marked the first time modern America experienced systemic failure created by its own success. It was not a war. It was not a natural disaster. It was an internally generated breakdown. This distinction matters because it forced a reevaluation of responsibility. Prosperity was no longer viewed as purely virtuous. It carried risk. The families who had dominated the era learned this lesson unevenly. Some institutionalized their wealth, embedding it in foundations, universities, and trusts. Others continued personal spending until resources dwindled. By the mid-20th century, many of the most famous names remained recognizable, but no longer dominant. Legacy outlasted control. The broader public absorbed the lesson differently. Skepticism toward concentrated power became a recurring theme in American culture. Distrust of monopolies, banks, and elites ebbed and flowed, but it never disappeared. Each subsequent crisis reactivated the memory, even when the historical details were forgotten. Importantly, the collapse reshaped the American definition of success. The 19th century had equated success with magnitude, bigger fortunes, bigger buildings, bigger influence. After the collapse, success became associated with endurance, stability over generations, institutions rather than individuals, longevity rather than spectacle. This redefinition influenced architecture, business strategy, and personal ambition. The private palace gave way to the corporate headquarters. The family name gave way to the brand. Personal authority gave way to organizational structure. These changes were not inevitable. They were responses to demonstrated failure. The Gilded Age did not end because society rejected wealth. It ended because society could no longer afford instability disguised as progress. The collapse forced a separation between growth and health, between accumulation and resilience. That distinction remains unresolved in modern economies. What makes this history relevant is not nostalgia. It is pattern recognition. The conditions that produced the collapse, rapid technological change, concentration of capital, speculative finance, weak regulation, and cultural worship of success, are not unique to the 19th century. They reappear whenever confidence outpaces structure. The Gilded Age's sudden break serves as a reminder that systems do not announce their limits politely. They hold together until they do not. And when they fail, the failure appears sudden only because the warning signs were normalized. The era did not conclude with reform alone. Reform followed rupture. The break came first. The lesson came later. And the cost was measured not only in lost fortunes, but in altered trust. Trust in markets, trust in leaders, trust in the idea that prosperity naturally sustains itself. That trust, once broken, never fully returns in the same form. What replaces it is caution, oversight, memory. And memory, when ignored, has a way of demanding repetition. By the time historians began labeling the period that followed as the Progressive Era, the damage had already been done. Reform did not prevent collapse, it responded to it. That distinction matters because it reveals how fragile the Gilded Age truly was. Its institutions did not bend under pressure, they snapped. Only afterward were new supports constructed, often hastily, imperfectly, and unevenly. One of the most enduring consequences of the break was the reorientation of power away from individuals and toward systems. During the height of the Gilded Age, economic authority was personal. Names mattered more than structures. Control rested in families, partnerships, and charismatic figures whose decisions could move markets. When those figures failed, there were few safeguards. Their collapse pulled entire sectors down with them. After the break, this model became untenable. Banks, corporations, and industries began insulating themselves from individual failure. Decision-making diffused, responsibility blurred. This did not reduce risk, but it redistributed it. Power became harder to identify and harder to challenge. The age of the visible titan gave way to the age of the institution. This shift altered how accountability functioned. When a single individual dominated an industry, blame could be assigned. When failure occurred within a system, responsibility dissolved into process. This transformation would define modern capitalism. It made wealth more durable, but also less transparent. The public response to this change was complex. On one hand, people demanded protections, regulation, oversight, and standards. On the other, they struggled to understand where power now resided. The Gilded Age collapse had taught Americans to distrust concentrated wealth, but it did not teach them how to track it once it became abstract. Culturally, the memory of sudden ruin lingered. Families who had once lived confidently within abundance now taught restraint. Heirs were raised with caution rather than certainty. Education replaced inheritance as a form of legitimacy. Professionalization replaced entitlement. These shifts were uneven, but they marked a departure from the assumptions that had fueled the previous era. Yet this restraint was not permanent. Memory fades faster than structure. As new industries emerged and new technologies reshaped markets, confidence returned. The lessons of the 1890s were remembered selectively. Safeguards were maintained just enough to enable growth, but rarely enough to prevent excess. This pattern repeated with striking consistency. The most dramatic repetition arrived with the Great Depression, which echoed the Gilded Age collapse on a far larger scale. The mechanisms were different, but the underlying dynamics were familiar. Rapid expansion, speculation, concentration, collapse, reform. The fact that these patterns re-emerged so clearly underscores the limits of historical learning. Societies remember outcomes more easily than causes. What the Gilded Age collapse truly demonstrated was that prosperity is not self-sustaining. It requires maintenance, it requires constraint, and it requires institutions capable of absorbing failure without transmitting it universally. The absence of these conditions turns growth into volatility. The mansions of the era provide a useful metaphor. They were impressive, costly, and rigid. They performed beautifully under ideal conditions, but they were unforgiving under stress. When income slowed, their demands did not. They could not adapt. They could not downsize. They could only persist or be abandoned. Modern economic systems face the same dilemma when designed for expansion without resilience. This is why the Gilded Age did not simply transition into something new. It fractured. The fracture forced redesign. But redesign did not erase the underlying incentives. It merely altered their expression. The fascination with this period persists because it exposes a truth that remains uncomfortable. Collapse does not require catastrophe. It requires imbalance. It requires confidence divorced from capacity. And it often arrives not with warning, but with disbelief. Those living through the collapse of the 1890s did not think they were at the end of an era. They believed they were experiencing a temporary disruption. Recovery was expected. Normalcy was assumed. That assumption delayed response. By the time the scale of failure became undeniable, options had narrowed. This misinterpretation is itself a lesson. Eras rarely announce their endings. They persist until their internal contradictions become unsustainable. The Gilded Age continued long after it should have adjusted. Its collapse was not inevitable because of greed alone, but because of rigidity. Systems built for growth refused to acknowledge limits. The aftermath reshaped American identity. Optimism did not vanish, but it became conditional. Progress was no longer assumed to be smooth or guaranteed. Risk entered the national consciousness. The belief in perpetual ascent gave way to cycles. Boom and bust replaced linear growth as the dominant narrative. This shift influenced everything from policy to personal ambition. Entrepreneurship became associated with risk management rather than conquest. Success became measured by survival as much as expansion. Failure lost some of its stigma, not because it was accepted, but because it became expected. Still, the tension remained. The desire for rapid advancement never disappeared. It simply waited for new vehicles. Each technological revolution revived familiar dynamics. Railroads gave way to automobiles, steel to electricity, oil to finance. Each wave promised transformation. Each carried hidden fragility. The Gilded Age collapse serves as a case study not because it was unique, but because it was foundational. It was the first modern demonstration of how quickly systems built on confidence could unravel. Later, collapses refined the lesson, but did not fundamentally alter it. Understanding this history requires abandoning the idea that progress naturally corrects itself. Correction requires intervention. Balance requires design. Without them, growth becomes a liability. The Gilded Age did not fail because Americans dreamed too big. It failed because they mistook expansion for stability. They assumed size implied strength. They believed success could outrun consequence. When the break came, it revealed the difference between wealth and durability, between appearance and structure, between power and resilience. Those distinctions remain unresolved today. The era's end was not marked by a single event, a single law, or a single collapse. It was marked by the realization that the system, as constructed, could not survive its own success. And once that realization took hold, the Gilded Age was already over, even if its architecture, its fortunes, and its myths lingered on. What followed was not a new age born cleanly from reform, but a long process of adjustment shaped by memory, denial, and repetition. The break was sudden, the consequences were permanent, and the pattern it revealed continues to shape every era that believes it is immune to the same fate. The final legacy of the Gilded Age collapse is not found in ruins or legislation alone, but in the permanent restructuring of how modern societies understand risk. Before the break, instability was viewed as temporary noise. After it, instability became a recognized feature of the system itself. That recognition quietly altered everything. In the decades that followed, American capitalism did not become gentler. It became more calculated. Risk was no longer ignored. It was redistributed. Losses that once devastated individual families or firms were increasingly absorbed by institutions, markets, and eventually governments. This did not eliminate collapse. It changed who felt it first and who felt it last. This evolution created a dangerous illusion of safety. When systems are large enough, failure appears distant. When responsibility is diffuse, accountability weakens. The Gilded Age collapse taught elites that visibility was dangerous, not that excess was. As a result, wealth retreated from architecture into abstraction. Money no longer needed marble to announce itself. It could move invisibly, faster than public understanding. That shift explains why later eras often misunderstood the lesson. Observers looked for the signs of past collapse, mansions, monopolists, flamboyant figures, and failed to recognize new forms of fragility. The Gilded Age taught how not to look rich, not how to avoid instability. The system learned camouflage, not restraint. This is why the phrase, "the Gilded Age ended," is misleading. What truly ended was its innocence. The belief that growth alone was proof of health. The belief that markets rewarded wisdom rather than momentum. The belief that private success naturally aligned with public good. These assumptions did not quietly evolve. They were shattered. Yet human behavior did not fundamentally change. Ambition remained. Competition intensified. Each generation convinced itself that new tools made old failures irrelevant. The memory of collapse softened into story. Story became myth. Myth became complacency. The warning embedded in the 1890s was clear but uncomfortable. Systems built for expansion will eventually encounter limits. When they do, the correction will not be proportional. It will be abrupt. And it will feel unfair precisely because it is structural rather than personal. The people living inside the Gilded Age, collapse did not feel like participants in a historical turning point. They felt confused, betrayed, disoriented. That is another enduring truth. Collapse is rarely cinematic. It is administrative. It arrives through bank notices, layoffs, canceled projects, quiet closures. The world does not explode. It contracts. This contraction reshapes values long before it reshapes policy. Aspirations narrow. Certainty erodes. Trust becomes conditional. The optimism that fueled the previous era does not vanish, but it fragments. Some cling to it harder. Others abandon it entirely. Society polarizes around competing interpretations of what went wrong. Those divisions were visible in the aftermath of the Gilded Age. Some blamed government inaction. Others blamed labor unrest. Some blamed speculation. Others blamed reform. There was no consensus, only exhaustion. That lack of clarity delayed meaningful change and allowed cycles to repeat. The most sobering aspect of the collapse is how familiar it feels in retrospect. Every warning sign was visible. Over-leveraged industries, concentrated wealth, political capture, cultural obsession with winners, dismissal of dissent as envy or ignorance. None of this was hidden. It was normalized. Normalization is the true danger. When imbalance becomes routine, it stops feeling dangerous. When instability becomes profitable, it stops being questioned. When confidence is rewarded, skepticism is punished. By the time doubt becomes acceptable, options have narrowed. The Gilded Age did not fail because no one understood economics. It failed because incentives discouraged restraint. The system rewarded speed, scale, and dominance. It penalized caution. Those who slowed down lost ground. Those who questioned growth were marginalized. The collapse was not a surprise to everyone. It was simply ignored by those benefiting most. This pattern explains why reform always follows crisis rather than preceding it. Change threatens advantage. Crisis removes it. Only when failure becomes unavoidable does adaptation occur. The Gilded Age collapse forced adaptation because it stripped away the illusion that advantage was permanent. Even then, adaptation was incomplete. Each reform addressed symptoms more than causes. Each stabilization created new vulnerabilities. The system survived, but it did not become invulnerable. It became cyclical. That cyclical nature is the true inheritance of the Gilded Age, not its mansions, not its names, but its pattern: rapid ascent, concentration, overconfidence, sudden correction, reform, forgetting, repeat. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires realism. Prosperity is not dangerous. Unexamined prosperity is. Growth is not harmful. Growth without buffers is. Wealth is not corrosive. Wealth without accountability is. The Gilded Age collapse remains relevant because it exposes how quickly confidence can outpace capacity, how easily success can disguise fragility, and how reluctant societies are to adjust until adjustment is forced upon them. The era did not drift into history. It collided with reality. It did not decline gracefully. It fractured under pressure, and it did not disappear. It transformed into something quieter, more complex, and harder to see. That transformation is why the Gilded Age feels both distant and immediate. Its architecture belongs to the past. Its dynamics do not. Every time growth accelerates faster than structure, the same conditions re-emerge. Every time wealth concentrates without constraint, the same risks accumulate. Every time confidence replaces caution, the same break becomes possible. The lesson of the Gilded Age is not that collapse is inevitable. It is that collapse becomes likely when societies mistake momentum for stability. The age did not end when reform arrived. It ended when belief failed. And once belief breaks, no amount of wealth can restore it to its original form. That is why the Gilded Age didn't end. It broke all at once. And the echo of that break still shapes how modern systems rise, strain, and fail, whether they recognize it or not. What ultimately defines the Gilded Age collapse is not how much wealth was lost, but how completely certainty vanished. After the break, Americans no longer trusted size as proof of strength. They no longer assumed continuity. And they no longer believed that success, once achieved, could simply be maintained through momentum alone. That shift in belief was irreversible. In the decades that followed, policymakers, financiers, and industrial leaders operated with a quiet awareness that had not existed before. Expansion was still pursued, but it was hedged. Risk was still taken, but it was disguised. The system did not become cautious in spirit. It became cautious in appearance. This distinction matters because it explains why collapse remains possible even in highly regulated environments. The Gilded Age had failed loudly and visibly. Later, systems learned to fail silently. Losses were distributed. Consequences were delayed. Pain was displaced downward and outward rather than concentrated at the top. This created the impression that collapse had been conquered, when in reality it had been reorganized. One of the most enduring changes was the professionalization of economic management. Where individual judgment once dominated, committees replaced personalities. Where intuition once guided investment, models took over. Where fortunes were once tied to physical assets, wealth migrated into paper, then into numbers. This abstraction increased efficiency, but it also increased distance between cause and effect. Distance weakens accountability. When outcomes feel detached from decisions, responsibility becomes theoretical. This was not an accident. It was an adaptation. The Gilded Age collapse had demonstrated the danger of visibility. Modern systems learned to obscure their mechanisms, making failure harder to trace and therefore harder to confront. This obscurity reshaped public engagement. Economic systems became harder to understand, even as they became more influential. Ordinary citizens felt the consequences of decisions they could not see and did not consent to. This disconnect fueled recurring cycles of anger, populism, and distrust. Each wave echoed the same underlying grievance: power without transparency. Yet transparency itself became contested. Complexity was framed as necessity. Specialization was framed as inevitability. The more complicated the system became, the easier it was to argue that only experts could manage it. This created a feedback loop in which control narrowed, even as participation widened in theory. The Gilded Age collapse was the first moment Americans encountered this paradox at scale. A system built to generate opportunity had, instead, produced exclusion. A system that promised upward mobility had delivered sudden precarity. The shock forced a reevaluation of what fairness meant in a modern economy. This reevaluation did not produce consensus. It produced tension. Competing visions of responsibility emerged. Some argued that individuals must accept risk as the price of freedom. Others insisted that collective systems must absorb risk to preserve stability. This debate, ignited by the collapse, has never been resolved. It resurfaces in every major crisis. What makes the Gilded Age particularly instructive is how confidently its participants believed they had transcended historical limits. Industrialists saw themselves as builders of a new world, unbound by old constraints. Technology, scale, and capital were expected to overcome scarcity, volatility, and resistance. This belief was not naive. It was reinforced by decades of success. Success is the most convincing form of evidence. It validates assumptions without testing them. The longer success continues, the more those assumptions harden into doctrine. By the time cracks appear, questioning feels unnecessary or even dangerous. This psychological dynamic played a decisive role in the collapse. Warnings existed. Economists, journalists, and labor leaders raised concerns about speculation, concentration, and instability. Their voices were dismissed as pessimistic, political, or uninformed. Growth had become its own justification. To challenge it was to challenge progress itself. When the break came, it did not just discredit individuals. It discredited an ideology. The idea that markets naturally self-correct without suffering. The idea that private accumulation naturally produces public good. The idea that scale inherently brings stability. These beliefs did not survive contact with reality. Still, ideologies rarely disappear completely. They retreat, adapt, and re-emerge under new language. The post-Gilded Age world replaced faith in individuals with faith in systems. But systems, too, reflect the values embedded in their design. If they prioritize speed over resilience, they recreate the same vulnerabilities in different form. This is why the Gilded Age collapse remains relevant beyond its historical moment. It is not simply a cautionary tale about excess. It is a lesson about design, about how incentives shape behavior, about how unchecked success produces blind spots, and about how societies delay correction until delay becomes impossible. The mansions that once symbolized dominance now function as museums, institutions, or ruins. They are often treated as curiosities, beautiful remnants of a vanished world. But their true significance lies not in their ornamentation, but in what they reveal about the logic of the era that produced them. They were built to impress, not to endure. They assumed continuity. They rejected constraint. Modern systems often repeat this logic invisibly. Digital platforms scale rapidly, without considering long-term stability. Financial instruments multiply without clear accountability. Wealth concentrates faster than institutions can adapt. The surface looks different. The pattern is familiar. The danger lies not in ambition, but in the refusal to examine it. The Gilded Age did not collapse because Americans wanted more. It collapsed because they refused to ask how much was sustainable, for whom, and under what conditions. That refusal was cultural as much as economic. Society celebrated winners and ignored costs. It equated criticism with obstruction. It framed regulation as interference. By the time consequences became undeniable, adjustment required trauma rather than choice. This dynamic explains why collapse feels sudden even when it is long in the making. Pressure accumulates quietly. Assumptions go untested. Alternatives are dismissed. Then one failure triggers another, and the illusion of control evaporates. The people who lived through the Gilded Age collapse often described it as bewildering. The world they understood no longer functioned. Rules they trusted no longer applied. That sense of disorientation is a hallmark of systemic failure. It marks the moment when belief systems lag behind reality. Recovery, when it comes, rarely restores the old order. It constructs something new atop the wreckage. But the foundations matter. If lessons are misunderstood, vulnerabilities persist. If reform addresses symptoms rather than structure, cycles repeat. The enduring lesson of the Gilded Age is not that wealth is dangerous. It is that unchecked systems are. Prosperity requires maintenance. Stability requires limits. Confidence requires verification. Without these, success becomes fragile. The age did not collapse because no one worked hard enough or innovated enough. It collapsed because innovation outpaced governance, because accumulation outpaced oversight, because belief outpaced design. Every era that experiences rapid growth faces this test. Some adjust early, others delay. The Gilded Age delayed until delay was no longer an option. That is why it did not end gently. It did not evolve smoothly. It did not transition by choice. It broke under the weight of its own assumptions, and in doing so, it revealed a pattern that remains embedded in modern life. When systems reward expansion without resilience, collapse is not a possibility. It is a matter of timing. By the time the dust settled, the Gilded Age had already transformed into something unrecognizable. Not because wealth disappeared, but because the relationship between wealth and certainty had been permanently severed. The collapse taught a lesson that could not be unlearned. Prosperity without restraint is unstable, and systems that grow faster than their safeguards eventually fail. This realization reshaped how power justified itself. Before the break, success was considered evidence of virtue. Fortunes were treated as proof of intelligence, discipline, and moral superiority. After the break, that logic weakened. Wealth could no longer claim innocence. It had demonstrated its capacity to destabilize entire societies when left unchecked. This shift altered public tolerance. Inequality had existed before, but after the collapse, it became harder to ignore. When millions lost livelihoods while concentrated fortunes survived, the contradiction became visible. Economic suffering was no longer viewed as individual failure alone. Structural explanations entered public consciousness. That change did not eliminate inequality, but it changed how inequality was debated. The legal and financial architecture of the 20th century emerged directly from this reckoning. Bankruptcy laws expanded. Corporate governance formalized. Banking oversight increased. These measures were not ideological triumphs. They were defensive adaptations. The goal was not fairness, it was containment. Yet containment came at a cost. As systems became more complex, they also became less legible. Ordinary citizens found themselves subject to forces they could neither see nor influence. This created a new form of instability: distrust. The Gilded Age collapse replaced blind confidence with chronic suspicion. Each boom carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Each success raised the question of durability. That anxiety never fully disappeared. It resurfaced during every major downturn, reminding society that stability is conditional. The belief that collapse was a relic of the past never fully took hold again. Even during periods of growth, the memory lingered. This is why the Gilded Age occupies such a powerful place in historical memory. It was the first time modern America confronted the limits of scale. The first time it learned that complexity could amplify failure rather than prevent it. The first time it experienced systemic breakdown without an external enemy to blame. Wars can be rationalized. Natural disasters can be mourned. Internal collapse is harder to process. It forces a society to confront its own design choices. The Gilded Age collapse made clear that the system had failed on its own terms. Importantly, the era did not collapse because its participants lacked intelligence or ambition. Many were highly capable. What they lacked was incentive to slow down. The system rewarded acceleration. It punished hesitation. Under those conditions, restraint became irrational at the individual level, even as it was essential at the collective level. This mismatch between individual incentives and systemic health lies at the heart of the collapse. It explains why warnings were ignored. It explains why reform arrived late, and it explains why similar patterns continue to reappear. Systems rarely self-correct when correction threatens advantage. The legacy of the Gilded Age is therefore not moral failure, but design failure. A system optimized for growth was asked to provide stability. It could not do both. When stress arrived, it responded the only way it could, by breaking. That break reshaped expectations. Afterward, Americans no longer believed that history moved in a straight line upward. Cycles replaced certainty. Risk became permanent. The future felt conditional rather than guaranteed. This shift influenced culture as deeply as policy. Literature, journalism, and political rhetoric adopted a more skeptical tone. Success was portrayed as temporary. Institutions were scrutinized. Authority was questioned. Even optimism became cautious. Yet, despite this awareness, the temptation to repeat the pattern remained strong. Each generation encountered new technologies and new opportunities that seemed to justify renewed confidence. Each believed it had learned enough from the past to avoid the same fate. Each underestimated how quickly success erodes restraint. The Gilded Age collapse stands as a reminder that history does not punish greed alone. It punishes imbalance. It punishes systems that mistake momentum for health. It punishes cultures that equate size with strength. The era's end was not marked by a single date or decision. It was marked by a loss of faith. Faith that growth would always solve its own problems. Faith that private success would align with public good. Faith that the future would resemble the past. Once that faith collapsed, the age was already over. What followed was not a clean break into something better, but a long negotiation between ambition and caution. That negotiation continues. It defines modern economies as much as it defined the world that emerged from the Gilded Age. The lesson is not that prosperity should be feared. It is that prosperity must be designed to survive itself. When it is not, collapse feels sudden only because its causes were accepted for too long. That is why the Gilded Age didn't end quietly. It didn't fade. It didn't evolve. It broke, Under pressure, it refused to acknowledge, and in breaking, it revealed a truth that remains deeply uncomfortable. Systems do not fail when they stop growing. They fail when growth outruns their capacity to endure it. That truth, learned once at extraordinary cost, continues to wait patiently for every era that believes it is different. What makes the collapse of the Gilded Age especially instructive is how little resistance there was once the break began. The system did not fight to preserve itself. It could not. Its defenses were designed for expansion, not for contraction. When growth stalled, the mechanisms that had amplified success now amplified failure. Credit, which had fueled expansion, became the accelerant of collapse. Debt obligations did not adjust downward when income disappeared. Contracts remained fixed while markets evaporated. This rigidity transformed what might have been a correction into a prolonged depression. The economy did not merely slow, it seized. This exposed another weakness of the era: time. The Gilded Age assumed continuity. Investments were made with the expectation that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, only larger. There was little tolerance for interruption. When interruption arrived, the system lacked patience. Short-term obligations crushed long-term potential. Assets were liquidated at the worst possible moment. Value was destroyed not because it no longer existed, but because it could not wait. The psychological impact of this was profound. Confidence, once lost, did not return quickly. Businesses hesitated to invest. Banks hesitated to lend. Consumers hesitated to spend. Fear replaced momentum. The very behaviors that might have accelerated recovery instead deepened stagnation. This feedback loop revealed how dependent modern economies are on belief. Belief, however, is fragile. It rests on shared assumptions. The Gilded Age collapse shattered those assumptions unevenly. Some lost faith in markets, others lost faith in government. Still, others lost faith in fellow citizens. The result was fragmentation. Competing explanations hardened into ideologies. Cooperation became harder just when it was most needed. This fragmentation shaped the political climate of the era. Economic debates became moral debates. Responsibility was personalized. Blame was assigned to groups rather than structures. These divisions delayed coherent response. They also set precedents for future crises, where disagreement over causes would complicate solutions. Yet beneath the noise, a quieter transformation was taking place. Institutions were learning. Slowly, imperfectly, they began to redesign themselves to account for volatility. Insurance expanded. Diversification became doctrine. Long-term planning gained legitimacy. These changes did not eliminate risk, but they acknowledged it. This acknowledgement marked the true end of the Gilded Age mindset. The era had believed in mastery, over markets, over labor, over nature itself. The collapse replaced mastery with management. Control gave way to mitigation. Confidence gave way to calculation. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Once a society recognizes risk as inherent, it cannot return to innocence. Every decision becomes conditional. Every expansion is shadowed by contingency. This awareness reshaped business culture, government policy, and personal ambition. Still, awareness alone does not prevent repetition. Knowledge does not automatically change incentives. The same forces that drove the Gilded Age, competition, ambition, technological change, continued to operate. They simply moved through new channels. Each innovation promised efficiency. Each created new vulnerabilities. The lesson of the collapse was not that growth should stop. It was that growth without buffers is dangerous. But buffers cost money. They slow returns. They reduce spectacle. In competitive environments, those who invest in resilience often lose ground to those who do not, at least temporarily. This creates a dilemma that no era fully resolves. The Gilded Age resolved it by ignoring the problem until collapse forced change. Later eras would do the same, though with more sophisticated tools. The pattern remains consistent. Expansion outpaces oversight, stress accumulates, correction arrives abruptly, reform follows, memory fades. Understanding this pattern reframes the collapse not as an anomaly, but as a structural outcome. The Gilded Age did not fail because of specific individuals or isolated mistakes. It failed because its design assumed conditions that could not be guaranteed. This is why its end feels so abrupt in retrospect. Systems built on assumption function smoothly until assumption fails. There is no gradual decline. There is a sudden mismatch between expectation and reality. When that mismatch becomes visible, confidence collapses faster than material conditions. The people who lived through the Gilded Age collapse often described it as a loss of orientation. The rules they had internalized no longer applied. Effort did not produce reward. Prudence did not guarantee safety. Relationships frayed under stress. This disorientation is another hallmark of systemic failure. Recovery eventually came, but it did not restore the old world. It constructed a new one atop altered expectations. Wealth survived, but it became quieter. Power persisted, but it became institutional. Growth resumed, but it was hedged. The cost of this transformation was borne unevenly. Those with buffers adapted. Those without absorbed the shock. This inequality hardened social divisions and shaped political movements for decades. The collapse did not simply redistribute wealth, it redistributed trust. That redistribution matters because trust is foundational. Markets rely on it, institutions depend on it, societies fracture without it. Once trust is damaged, rebuilding it requires time, transparency, and restraint, qualities that competitive systems struggle to sustain. The Gilded Age collapse therefore occupies a unique place in history. It was not merely an economic event, it was a cultural reckoning. It forced a confrontation with the limits of optimism and the cost of ignoring structure. The era ended not when reformers passed laws, but when belief systems failed, when success could no longer explain itself, when growth no longer felt safe. From that moment forward, American prosperity carried an asterisk, an awareness that expansion could reverse. That stability required maintenance. That progress was conditional. That awareness has never fully disappeared. It recedes during booms. It resurfaces during crises. It shapes decisions quietly, often unconsciously. It is the invisible inheritance of the Gilded Age collapse. And that inheritance carries a warning that remains relevant. Systems do not announce when they are approaching their limits. They function normally until they do not. When the break comes, it feels sudden only because warning signs were mistaken for success. The Gilded Age did not miscalculate once. It miscalculated continuously until reality intervened. And when it did, the age ended not with decline, but with rupture. That rupture remains one of the clearest demonstrations of how quickly confidence can turn into collapse when structure lags behind ambition. By the early 20th century, the shock of the Gilded Age collapse had settled into something quieter but more enduring, caution embedded into habit. The economy recovered, industries reorganized, and new fortunes appeared, but the psychological framework had changed. Growth was no longer assumed to be permanent, it was provisional. This shift altered how Americans related to time. During the Gilded Age, the future was imagined as an extension of the present, only larger and richer. After the break, the future became uncertain terrain. Planning replaced assumption. Contingency replaced confidence. This was not pessimism. It was adaptation born of failure. The institutions that emerged reflected this. Altered mindset. Banks began to prioritize solvency over spectacle. Corporations emphasized continuity rather than conquest. Wealthy families increasingly sought insulation through diversification, legal structures, and professional management. These practices were not driven by ethics. They were driven by memory. Memory, however, is selective. As distance from the collapse grew, its emotional intensity faded. The lesson remained intellectually understood, but emotionally dulled. New generations inherited safeguards without inheriting fear. This created space for risk to expand again, slowly at first, then with renewed confidence. This cycle reveals a central paradox of economic history. The very mechanisms that prevent collapse also make it easier to forget why they exist. Regulation stabilizes markets, which encourages experimentation. Experimentation drives growth, which pressures regulation. Over time, safeguards are loosened or circumvented in the name of efficiency. Stability plants the seeds of its own erosion. The Gilded Age collapse was the first modern demonstration of this paradox. It showed how success can undermine the conditions that made it possible. It also showed how societies rarely sustain vigilance once danger recedes. This dynamic explains why the Gilded Age feels perpetually relevant. It is not frozen in the past. It is embedded in process. Each era reenacts its logic under different circumstances. The actors change, the technologies evolve, the pattern persists. What distinguishes the Gilded Age is how visible its failure was. The collapse stripped away the symbols of permanence. Mansions were abandoned. Enterprises dissolved. Names that had dominated headlines vanished from influence. This visibility forced confrontation. Later collapses would be less theatrical, but no less disruptive. Visibility matters because it shapes response. When failure is visible, accountability becomes possible. When it is abstract, responsibility disperses. The Gilded Age collapse occurred at a moment when wealth was still physically anchored. Its undoing could be seen. That made denial harder. As wealth migrated into abstraction in later eras, collapse became harder to locate. Pain still occurred, but its sources became diffuse. This diffusion complicated reform. It allowed systems to persist without fully addressing their vulnerabilities. The legacy of the Gilded Age collapse is therefore double-edged. It produced safeguards that stabilized growth. It also encouraged strategies that concealed fragility. The lesson learned was not how to eliminate risk, but how to manage perception of it. This distinction matters because perception influences behavior. When risk feels distant, it is tolerated. When it feels imminent, it is resisted. The Gilded Age collapse reset perception abruptly. Later eras would experience similar resets, each time surprised despite precedent. The endurance of this pattern suggests that collapse is not simply an economic failure. It is a failure of imagination. Societies struggle to envision limits while success continues. They extrapolate trends rather than interrogate structures. They mistake acceleration for health. The Gilded Age did not lack intelligence, resources, or innovation. It lacked brakes. Its system rewarded momentum and punished restraint. Under those conditions, collapse was not an aberration. It was an outcome delayed by optimism. This understanding reframes responsibility. The collapse was not caused by a few reckless actors. It was produced by a system that made recklessness rational. That is why blame alone cannot prevent repetition. Only redesign can. Redesign, however, is politically difficult. It challenges advantage. It imposes costs in the present to prevent losses in the future. In competitive societies, such trade-offs are resisted until crisis removes alternatives. The Gilded Age collapse forced redesign because it eliminated choice. The same dynamic governs modern crises. Change rarely arrives by consensus. It arrives by necessity. The Gilded Age collapse established this rhythm early in American history, setting expectations for how transformation occurs. The age ended not because Americans decided it should. It ended because it could no longer function. Its assumptions failed under stress. Its structures proved insufficient. Its confidence outpaced its capacity. What followed was not an enlightened awakening, but a pragmatic adjustment. Systems were modified to survive, not to become just. Inequality persisted. Power consolidated in new forms. But volatility was acknowledged, and that acknowledgement shaped design. This distinction is crucial. The collapse did not produce utopia. It produced durability. That durability allowed prosperity to return, but it also allowed complacency to grow. Over time, the memory of rupture softened into history. Yet history has a way of resurfacing when conditions align. Each time growth accelerates faster than oversight, the shadow of the Gilded Age lengthens. Each time wealth concentrates without buffers, the same questions reappear. Each time confidence silences caution, the same risks accumulate. The Gilded Age did not end because its values disappeared. It ended because its contradictions became unsustainable. Those contradictions, between speed and stability, ambition and resilience, private gain and public risk, remain unresolved. That is why the era continues to matter. Not as a moral fable, but as a structural case study. It shows how systems behave when success blinds them to fragility. It shows how collapse feels sudden only because warning signs were normalized. The age broke when belief failed, and belief, once broken, reshapes behavior long after structures are rebuilt. That reshaping is the true aftermath of the Gilded Age collapse. It is not found in legislation alone, or in preserved mansions, or in faded photographs. It is found in the permanent awareness that prosperity is conditional, that growth requires limits, and that systems ignoring those truths eventually confront them all at once. The Gilded Age did not drift into the 20th century. It fractured at the edge of its own confidence. And in that fracture, modern America learned again and again that stability is not the opposite of growth. It is what growth must be designed to survive,